Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel. I want to throw out some quick apologies for this episode being a little bit late. I attended LTUE in Provo, Utah, which is Life, the Universe, and Everything. It is a symposium for writers and filmmakers and gamers and also nerds and geeks of all stripes. And it was fantastic. I highly recommend it to anybody interested in any of those things. But yeah, that kind of put a little bit of a crimp in the schedule. So that's why this episode is a little late. And without any further ado, I'm just going to jump into it because we have got mounds to cover, and we have finally made it to actually reviewing Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, blow by blow, scene by scene. Here we go. Release all moorings. Engage. 5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. It is 1982. Magazines like Starlog and Cinefantastique, along with innumerable fanzines, have been a Twitter with rumors long before there was a Twitter, of course. And now you are seated in the movie theater. It is the moment of truth. You've watched whatever trailers they had. People are crunching candy and candy wrappers, popcorn, slurping from soda. The Paramount logo shows up. A mountain. It gives way to a sound. It is a high-pitched keening. And then you hear the opening notes of Alexander Courage Star Trek theme. Overlaid with that is a simple caption. The 23rd century. Interestingly enough, this is the first time Star Trek rooted itself as occurring in the 23rd century. Gene Roddenberry had originally said it could happen anywhere from the 21st century to the 31st century. But Star Trek II firmly establishes the 23rd century. And then we get a rousing score, just a sweeping score by James Horner. Now, James Horner got the opportunity to do this because they were trying to save money, as we've discussed in past episodes. So Jerry Goldsmith is now way too expensive. They can't afford him. James Horner is only 28. Now, he's scored some other stuff before. His score wasn't the problem, but some of the stuff he's scored before, not so great. Battle Beyond the Stars is a notable one. If you can find it on MST3K, it's fun on MST3K. Not so great on its own. Very, very clearly a money grab trying to cash in on Star Wars. But he had done the score for that, and he actually borrows from it heavily. Now, this is something that some detractors of James Horner actually bring up repeatedly, that he borrows from his own material quite a bit, and this is no different. There are some pieces from Battle Beyond the Stars that show up in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. The Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, parts of this show up in Die Hard. James Horner went on to score Star Trek III as well. And a lot of those sequences, if you have ever watched Aliens, which he also scored, and on Aliens, he should be cut some slack because producer Gail Ann Hurd and James Cameron really didn't give him a whole lot of time. So he had to reuse, I think, a portion of a ballet, and most noticeably, the Klingon theme from Star Trek III is kind of the colonial marine theme. especially when Ripley goes to the rescue into Sublevel 3. That's really, really telling. Easily identifiable piece of music. James Horner, of course, one of the better composers of recent years, certainly. I mean, he went on to do Titanic, Braveheart. I mean, some just key scores. So Star Trek II is really lucky to land him, and I think he has done a really, really outstanding job on this film. There is a piece of music that is part of this film, and if you haven't rewatched Star Trek II yet, do yourself a favor before rewatching Star Trek II. Go on to Spotify or whatever and find a piece of music called "Battle in the Mutara Nebula," and just listen to it, and you can tell exactly what has happened. Even if you've never seen Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, you can tell exactly what's going on. He has leitmotifs for the Enterprise, leitmotifs for Kirk, for Khan, for the Reliant, and the Nebula. You can actually visualize everything just through his score. And that is really amazing. It's very, very incredible. It's a staple of my kind of writing music that I put on when I'm writing scenes, because it is so evocative. Unfortunately, the year 2015 was a bad year for Star Trek. James Horner perished in a plane crash. Leonard Nimoy died that year, and Harve Bennett, the producer of Star Trek II, also died that year. So not a good year. But in any case, to get back to Star Trek II, we now, the starfield that's sweeping around, which it's done so low tech, as opposed to like nowadays we would just do a CGI starfield, super easy. They just took a camera, pointed it up at the ceiling in a planetarium, and then panned it. And that's how they get the sweeping starfield. It's like super low tech. It works, right? A lot of the visual effects on this is the heyday of really just artistry in visual effects. I'm not deriding people in visual effects now, but it is a different kind of art. Everything is done through CGI now, whereas it was much more handcrafted back then. And actually, what's funny is some of the techniques I'm going to describe here are still in use today on kind of Star Trek's spiritual successor, the Orville. The Orville uses some of these techniques of models and motion control, compounded with CGI added. And that's actually fitting, because CGI kind of got its start on Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, and we'll get to that when we get to that scene. But not to keep you in too much suspense, it's the scene that describes how Genesis works. That's one of the first CGI things used in a motion picture ever. So we get this, the sweeping starfield. The opening credits are very slow. They hail back to when Hollywood did like overtures before, like Ben-Hur and Spartacus and stuff like that. There's really nothing going on. They're just introducing characters. There's no secrets in this film. You know that Ricardo Montalban is back. He's on the movie poster. You know the movie is called The Wrath of Khan. They introduce some major characters in the credits. They just tell you who they are. Now, you don't know who they are, but it'll say Merritt Bucktrick as, David. You don't know who David is, but they just tell you who it is. And then introducing Kirstie Alley. This is her first film, big Hollywood picture. So it yields right to her voice. It's Kirstie Alley speaking. We don't know who it is. And she's saying Captain's Log, which we're used to hearing Kirk say. So it is a little bit off-putting, and it shows, it opens on a graphic of kind of advanced rendering of the Enterprise, kind of spinning in a shield matrix. That's what it looks like. And it's over, Spock's shoulder. So we briefly talked about this, that when they did these displays, these are not TVs because of the refresh rate. So every little monitor that you see is actually a rear projected piece of film that's on a loop, which is kind of insane when you think about the logistics into making the bridge work. And the bridge has to work because this movie, to save money, more than 60% of the film is actually filmed on the same set. It's either the Kobayashi Maru simulator, that is later redressed as the Enterprise Bridge, which is later redressed as the Reliance Bridge. So it's, this is kind of a TV budget. They have Harv Bennett, who is a TV producer, and he is going to wring as much savings out as he can by just changing little things here and there. Now, as a quick aside, Kirstie Alley gets the job because she's a big Star Trek fan. And so she used to actually imitate Leonard Nimoy's portrayal of Spock and pretend to be Spock's daughter. And so when she auditioned, she played Spock. There's another interesting side note about Saavik. There's actually a lot going on with that character. But when they first wrote Saavik for the script, you'll remember we were talking about Star Trek Phase 2 and how there was a Vulcan named Zahn. Essentially, Saavik was the heir of Zahn in a storytelling kind of way. And Saavik was written as a male Vulcan. And the giveaway is that when they changed Saavik's gender, they never changed her name. So this is like a bit of a Trekkie nerddom, but Vulcan males have names that tend to start with an S and end with a hard sound. So you get Spock, you get Surak, you get Sarek, right? And so Saavik is a Vulcan male name. And female Vulcans tend to have names like T'Pau and T'Pring. And this is not acknowledged anywhere in the film. It could be a mistake, but there is something else about Saavik that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So the bridge pans around, of course, gives no inkling to the audience that this is a simulator. We see everybody we're used to seeing at their stations. There's Spock, there's Sulu, there's Uhura. McCoy is on the bridge for some reason, but we've seen that the chief medical officer tends to loiter on the bridge a lot, like for no reason, right? And then we get to the center seat, the captain's chair, and there is kind of a big dramatic pan where Saavik kind of swings around and she is in command. And it's supposed to be a little bit shocking because we're used to seeing Kirk there. Kirk's supposed to be there. Chekhov is also noticeably missing. So this is all part of a ploy, and we spoke about it before. That the rumor that Spock was going to be killed in Star Trek II had already leaked. Everyone kind of knew it. Everyone kind of suspected it. Their fans were very upset about it. It was very controversial. So they set up, hey, this is the Enterprise. You're on the ship with the crew, and there's a different captain at the helm. They start to introduce this crisis, right? The Kobayashi Maru has struck a gravitic mine, and they're stuck in the neutral zone. And the Enterprise needs to go in there to get to rescue them, right? So Saavik does what she should do. There's no one else to rescue. They look at the ship's manifest, and there's 300 or so passengers on board. And Saavik does something very un-Vulcan-like because we notice her point of years right away. So we know she's a Vulcan. But she says, damn, right? So there's a little hint that something's not quite okay with her. There's another little hint. She's wearing jewelry. She's wearing kind of a little red earring that catches the light and sparkles. So it kind of is interesting there. And they don't they don't give any hints about it. Now, I'm going to talk about this now, but we're also going to come back to it. The idea is that Saavik is half Vulcan and half Romulan. And so it then follows with a little bit of headcanon, a little bit of a headcanon. You can say that perhaps her Romulan parentage did not understand the Vulcan naming conventions, and they accidentally gave her a male name, called her Saavik instead of Tsav or something, so they didn't quite understand. We don't know. We never get told. There are a couple of times that her Romulan heritage is brought up in the film. And I will talk about those scenes when we get in there. It really doesn't matter. There's, interestingly enough, Kirstie Alley did not return for Star Trek 3, and Robin Curtis wound up assuming the role of Saavik for Star Trek 3. What's curious is by Star Trek 3, all the Romulanness is gone, and Robin Curtis played her as a straight Vulcan. I think that the half Romulan Saavik is a more interesting character. Another interesting side note is that there was another actress up for the role of Saavik who lost out to Kirstie Alley, and that was Kim Cattrall. And Kim Cattrall winds up playing Lieutenant Valeris in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, which was the original name of this film. So it's just funny how it's almost like certain people are fated to be where they're at. There's also some contention on people address Saavik as Mr. Saavik throughout the entire film. There was some contention about that the gender neutral term that they're using is kind of weird that they're calling her Mr. But this goes back to like nautical tradition where everybody who's below a certain rank is called Mr., is addressed as Mr., because the true lady is the ship. So one of the things that Nicolas Meyer brought to this film is that he described it as nautical but nice. He added a bunch of naval stuff in there. And we should probably take a brief moment to talk about the uniforms. These uniforms are my favorite uniforms in all of Star Trek. They're these kind of red, more militaristic looking uniforms. They have bloused pants. They have kind of these like open jacket things that come down, and they have a rank structure that isn't down to the ribbons. Now, Lee Cole, who was the art director, kind of just came up with that out of whole cloth and everything. Now, keep in mind, a lot of the people working on Star Trek, even at this point in Star Trek II, are veterans. So they are bringing a lot of that expertise, a lot of that quote-unquote realism to the film. And it shows. You've got different things. We'll talk about, like, for instance, stuff that no one really ever notices. I might be the only one who notices this, but... And there's no way for the audience to know this. They don't explain any of it, which is beautiful in a certain way, I think. But the color of the turtlenecks, because all the uniforms are red, so there's no way to really denote kind of department. In the original Star Trek, you kind of had the tunic colors told you, well, famously, if you're a red shirt, you're probably going to die because you're security or your communications or your engineering, right? But if you're a security guard, you're probably dead. Blue was for medical and science staff. Gold was for command, navigation, people on the command track, right? So they kind of keep that, but change the colors up a little bit. So white becomes the color of command, and you'll see that with Captain Spock and, of course, Admiral Kirk. Gray is the color of science officers. Green is medical. Red is now for cadets and trainees. And that carries over to engineering as well. Even though they're not wearing the same uniform, they're wearing more kind of functional radiation suits, which is what you'd be expecting if you were actually like in some kind of a space engine room. And then black is for enlisted ranks. we jump back to the Kobayashi Maru test, right? So McCoy is loitering on the bridge. I think that's where we left off. Some of the eagle-eyed people, if you look, it's on screen for, I don't know, maybe a second. There's actually a schematic of a 3-nacelled Federation dreadnought that folks who play Starfleet battles and everything will know that. And it's just kind of weird that there's 3 nacelles because like Gene Roddenberry had a rule that he had established in the Next Generation that said that warp nacelles could only show up in pairs. What's interesting about that is, of course, in the final episode of The Next Generation, All Good Things, there is a dreadnought version of the Galaxy-class Enterprise that has 3 nacelles in the exact same configuration. As you can see on the screen for about a half a second in Star Trek II during the Kobayashi Maru. There's also another hilarious thing, and it is not a blooper, and it is not kind of an Easter egg joke. There is a sign that says no smoking at any time on the bridge. It's like right next to the turbolift door, right as folks are coming in, the camera's panning around. You can see it clear as day. It's gone once they're on the Enterprise. And the idea behind it, Nicolas Meyer felt that like people would still be doing normal things, quote unquote, in the 23rd century. So he figured that people might still be smoking. But he thought it would be unprofessional for folks to be smoking on the bridge, hence the sign. They wound up taking it down because it did cause a little bit of controversy, but it's still there in that scene. So it's just kind of cool. So, of course, we all know the Kobayashi Maru is to establish a no-win scenario. And sure enough, no sooner have they entered the neutral zone, they're in violation of treaty, 3 Klingon ships show up. Interestingly enough, the footage is, remember, we're trying to save money, right? So the footage is from Star Trek The Motion Picture. It is the Imperial cruiser Amok and I think Kundar, who are, or Amar and Kundar, who are attacking V'ger at the beginning of Star Trek The Motion Picture. It is the exact same footage. The Klingons fire a torpedo. Now, I need to stop and talk about masterful storytelling and how Nicolas Meyer sets up the audience to do things and understand things that they may not know. Joe Jennings, who is one of the production designers, he has a great kind of mantra that he says. He's like, within science fiction, you have to establish the rules, and then you need to be consistent within those rules. And internal consistency is something that makes a lot of modern films not work. And there's a lot of hand-wavium that goes around that, oh, hey, you're nitpicking and you don't know how to have fun and just go in there and turn your brain off. And it's like, well, if the storyteller has done their job, you do not need to be an expert to understand what's going on, and yet they can still tell a complicated story. And one of the things that Nicolas Meyer does is he primes the audience to understand exactly what's going to happen when Khan attacks the Enterprise later, using this scene of the Kobayashi Maru. So he has the Klingons fire a torpedo. It hits the Enterprise, and it shows the Enterprise putting shields up. It shows them going to red alert. It shows that Kirstie Alley kind of does everything right. That primes the audience subconsciously so that when they run into a similar situation, when Reliant is coming at them and they don't know what's going on, why isn't Kirk raising the shields? We've seen him do it before. Even if you don't remember, you may not remember, but your brain did. So it's just, we get to see Saavik do everything correctly. That she tries to hail the Klingons. Klingons don't answer. They're jamming all the frequencies. She raises shields, goes to red alert. The Klingons fire a torpedo. Because it's the Kobayashi Maru, the shields don't do a damn thing. So the torpedo goes right through. Sulu's the first one to die. So he gets blown up and dies. Now, keep in mind, We watching the film today, we know this is the Kobayashi Maru. When you were watching it in 82, you didn't know. You just saw the console blow up and Sulu is done, right? And then there's more explosions and McCoy goes down and Hura goes down, right? And Saavik hits engineering. And this is really important. She hits engineering and she says, Mr. Scott, damage report. And Scotty comes back and says, the main energizer is hit. We're dead in space. Obviously, really, really bad. You don't need to be an expert on Star Trek or on ships or on engineering or anything like that to understand what that means. If you are an expert, you go, oh, the mains are offline. That is super bad, right? But then he explains it in just very easy colloquial terms. We're dead in space. Right after he says that, somebody says the shields are going down. You know that's bad. Spock turns and says something and gets blown up. So now everybody who heard the rumor that Spock dies in this movie, well, you just got what you were expecting. And boom, Spock's dead, right? And he's lying there. He's very clearly dead. Saavik is left alone on the bridge. She hits the comm and says, launch the log buoy, abandon ship, right? And then we hear William Shatner, Kirk, and he's like, okay, open her up. And he is backlit. He looks almost like a god stepping onto the bridge, right? And it's not an accident. Nicolas Meyer is using cinematic language here because film is a visual medium. Now, an interesting thing about Star Trek, and I'm not sure if I'd mentioned it before, is that you can listen to Star Trek and know everything that is happening on the old TOS TV shows. And that's part of the reason why they repeat orders, and it's part of the reason why there are cued sound effects when people push buttons and everything like that. So it's an interesting exercise. Pick one of the episodes that you really like and put it on and just don't watch it. Just listen to it. And you won't ever have to look up to find out what's going on. That's why they use a lot of radio conventions. That's why they have the captain's log to very cleanly introduce you to the story, introduce you out. The music uses stingers and cues to highlight exactly what is happening. When they say things like, engage full impulse power, you hear Sulu say full impulse power, I, and then you'll hear a button push, right? Bleep, bleep, bleep. And then you hear the engines ramp up, right? You hear all that stuff. It is exactly a radio play. Now, Nicolas Meyer is taking it a bit beyond that. He does some things in this movie that we don't tend to see in a lot of the other Star Trek films. He will use cutaways, and I don't know what the technical term for this is, so I'll just describe it. He will have something like when they say, we're trying to hail the Kobayashi Maru. And then you hear the captain of the Kobayashi Maru saying, yay, this is the Kobayashi Maru. We have struck a gravitic mine. It is not showing the faces of the people that are listening to it. The camera cuts away to what is apparently a speaker on the roof of the bridge. And that's where the voice is coming from. When Kirstie Alley and later when Kirk orders a red alert, he cuts to a little cutaway of this symbol going to red alert, and kind of flashing. And it's only on the screen for like maybe a second, but it just gives you context. It gives you a sense that things are happening, things are moving without jump cutting from place to place. And honestly, what it helps to do is it breaks up what would be these long static shots sitting on the bridge. If you're shooting on one set, how do you break that up? Well, you can cut between maybe 3 cameras or something, and medium and close-up shots. But this gives you another avenue, another trick to use, like close-ups of Spock's console, things like that, that just bounce back and forth. It's an excellent technique, and I think Star Trek II is one of the few films that actually does that, like actively. And Star Trek 6 might do it too, because that was the same director. So in any case, the reason I adore what's going on here is that the entire sequence lasts less than 7 minutes. And what Nicolas Meyer has done is he has lured the audience into a false sense of security because he showed you Spock. That's what you were afraid of. You were afraid of Spock dying. He killed Spock in the first 5 minutes. Spock's dead. Your fears are over, right? Not just is Spock dead, the entire crew is dead. So you know there's something up because they're not going to kill off the entire crew in the first 5 minutes of the movie, right? So you know something's up. So he's tricked the audience. The second thing he's done is he's primed the audience subliminally to understand exactly what's going to happen. Because to jump ahead a little bit, when the Reliant attacks Enterprise and Khan hits the Enterprise, Kirk calls to Scotty for a damage report. Scotty says almost word for word what he told to Saavik in the Kobayashi Maru. The main energizer's out, is what he says. We've heard it before. We heard it in the Kobayashi Maru when everyone died. That's not a good thing. That's really, really bad. Kirk then gives the exact same order that Saavik gave. Saavik says, go to emergency power. Kirk says, try auxiliary power. She says, try auxiliary power as well, not emergency power. And they wind up getting hit again and having to go on batteries. So, which again, going through that route, it sets up this whole submarine nautical idea, right? So, in any case, the bridge opens up behind the view screen. Kirk walks in, backlit, standing there. He's on the bridge where he belongs. He is the hero with a capital H. He's what we need, right? And he comes in and he kind of gives, he walks over to Spock and says, hey, Captain. And Spock orders all the cadets into a debriefing. So they all leave, except for Saavik. She kind of just stands by her seat, and you can tell she's upset. Again, she does an outstanding job, considering that this is like her first film. You know what I mean? She's a new young actress, and she does an outstanding job here because you can see that Saavik is trying not to be emotional, and she's very clearly pissed off at her performance. And she's pissed that the test wasn't fair. And she brings that up to Kirk, and Kirk says, well, how we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life. And inside 7 minutes, Nicolas Meyer has tricked the audience, primed the audience subliminally to understand exactly how things work on a starship, and given you the theme of the film in 7 minutes. Less than that, because the opening credits are like 2 minutes long. So it's just amazing that, this is really, really good storytelling. Just fantastic. And it just skips by you when you're watching it. You don't think you're watching anything profound, and you don't even notice it, but your brain did. So, he then, walks over to McCoy, and McCoy and him share a little exchange, and he's like, hey, what'd you think of my performance? And he kind of shuts McCoy down. He's like, oh, I'm not a drama critic or whatever. And then McCoy asks a very poignant question. He goes, wouldn't it be just easier to put a new crew, to replace the crew essentially? Like, why are they going out on this training thing? And that's actually a very valid question. You're like, why are all these senior officers kind of shepherding this training crew? What's going on here? And this is a bit of headcanon. This is not in the film anywhere or anything. But my guess is that when starships come in for refit, for whatever, they may use those starships as training things. And of course, Spock is now assigned to the Enterprise. He's also assigned to Starfleet Academy So he is now the current captain of the Enterprise. Everyone else is still assigned to the Enterprise except one, Sulu, and we'll talk about him in a little bit. But so, we know that Chekhov he's not there, so he's no longer assigned to the Enterprise. And that it's their turn to rotate through and do this kind of training crew, and it lets up-and-coming Starfleet Academy cadets train with active duty officers and enlisted on an actual ship. So it's kind of a big deal. Some of the military academies have programs like that today. For instance, at the Air Force Academy, they send us out to a program called Ops Air Force, where we kind of took part in squadron operations for upwards of a month. It was actually shorter than a month. The Coast Guard Academy goes out and they have a ship that they actually take out, and they still learn how to navigate with sexnets and stuff. So it's not too far-fetched to think that that's what's going on and why these officers, the crew of the Enterprise, is actually there. Now, story-wise, what's going on is that Spock is minding the store. We know that Kirk is always going to be the captain of the Enterprise, and Spock is kind of minding the store. He's just holding things in place until Kirk comes back to take his rightful place as the best starship captain in Starfleet. Now, you might also think that within headcanon space that Spock knows this, and he is kind of holding everything in place for Kirk to come back and be where he needs to be. Tellingly, once McCoy asked that question, though, Kirk says the other theme of the movie. He says, "Galloping around the cosmos is a game for the young." To which the rest of the crew is like, what is that supposed to mean? Because they're not exactly old. They're approaching middle age. I think if you do the math, Kirk is about 52 here. And keep in mind, he was like the youngest Starfleet captain when he made captain. So he's probably one of the youngest admirals too. He is celebrating his 52nd birthday. So, but he walks out and he sees Spock, and they totally hang a lantern on all the fan theories and everything. The very first line he says to him in this scene is, he goes, "Aren't you dead?" And it's just really, really funny. He addresses the Tale of Two Cities, and Spock says, it's the best of times, it's your birthday, so happy birthday. And it's really funny when Kirk, again, we get into the whole age thing, right? When Kirk goes to read the opening of A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. He's holding the book at arm's length. He can't read it. So it's very clear he's growing old. He may be past his prime. That's what Kirk's theme is all about. It's all about growing old and age, and and the life that passed you by, the road not taken. And just as another quick aside that I found funny is when Kirk and Spock are having this conversation, they pass this hapless dude who is like vacuuming in the hallway and with like a backpack vacuum on. And it's a very 1982 sci-fi thing, because nowadays you would just assume they had like, some kind of upgraded 23rd century Roomba that would do that. But I'm like, man, in this Gene Roddenberry utopia where there's no economy and everybody can just do what they want because they have like a universal basic income and replicators, there still needs to be people that vacuum hallways, and apparently like that's what this guy likes doing. So that's what he does. It just struck me as kind of funny. So we cut from that to, Kirk reflecting on age and everything, to his apartment. And we see that he's got just a bevy of antiques. He's got guns. He's got He's got all kinds of stuff. If you look behind in one of the scenes, it's actually a really nerd moment because one of the antiques he has is a Commodore PET computer that's really noticeable. It just stands out. Which was not all that old at the time. It was precursor to the Commodore 64. But yeah, it's sitting out there, and you can clearly see the monitor flashing there. Bones shows up and he brings him Romulan ale, right? And they sit there and they talk about how it's illegal. And then McCoy answers. Now, keep in mind, Bones comes from a Western trope, the sawbones and everything. So he's very much the old Western doctor. And he answers, I only use it for medicinal purposes, which just completely fits in with like people using whiskey for medicinal purposes. And then he talks about how he has a ship that like brings it across the border every so often. So Bones is actively involved in smuggling, which is again a little storytelling hint that the future is not the utopia it's cracked up to be, because they talk about that. And then he chides Kirk. He goes, don't be a prude. Don't turn down my gift. And then he breaks out this other gift and he goes, these are 400-year-old glasses, and it's hard to find ones with the lenses still intact. Now, I think this is Bones just kind of making the gift out to be more than it is, because he had to have known Kirk's prescription. He didn't just find glasses that happened to have lenses with Kirk's prescription, But what's interesting is that Kirk doesn't know what they are. When he takes them out of a bag, he doesn't know what they are. He says, he goes, what are these? He doesn't know what eyeglasses are. And then McCoy explains, they're for your eyes. Normally I'd prescribe Retinox. And then Kirk explains he's allergic to it. So he can't do that, right? And then Kirk is kind of being really, really just down about everything. And McCoy calls him on it. McCoy's like, why are we treating your birthday like it's a funeral? And Kirk is talking about how he's growing old and how he doesn't like being old. He's going through this midlife crisis, right? And McCoy tells him he's kind of full of crap. He's like, you're not worried about growing old. You're worried about losing your command. That now he's stuck behind a desk, right? He's not out there at the helm of a starship, like commanding, doing what he needs to do, exploring. All that's behind him, right? And Kirk answers with a very telling line. He says, spare me your notions of poetry, Doctor. We all have our assigned duties, right? So Kirk has kind of become a slave to his notion of duty and honor and what it is to be an officer in Starfleet. And it's like, well, he's been promoted past his ideal duty. And we kind of get hints that he's not a very good admiral. He's just going through the motions. He's not passionate about it. He doesn't really like it. And McCoy calls him on it. He goes, no, you're just hiding behind rules and regulations. But Kirk is kind of moping for now that he's, when he was in command of the Enterprise, that was worth it. All the other stuff that he sacrificed, not having a family, not having a wife, not being able to sit in one place, not even having his apartment looks like, frankly, a set decorator put it together, which might not be too far-fetched, because if you're a Starfleet captain, how often are you back on Earth, right? Probably not a lot. So all those things are worth it if you're commanding the Enterprise. But now if you're riding a desk in San Francisco, maybe it's not as worth it anymore. And that's basically what Kirk's getting at, again, just hammering home the theme of the film. We then cut to the Reliant, and we see the dish. The way they shoot it is very, very, very cool. You see the dish and you assume it's a ship like we've always seen. It's another Constitution-class refit starship. Oh, but hold up. This thing has kind of a roll bar, and the nacelles are on the bottom. That's kind of weird. We've never seen that before. And there's a funny story that Harv Bennett was overseas. He was filming a film about Golda Meir, I think. And they sent him a schematic of the Reliant and to sign off on it, to approve, the building of the model and everything. And he opened the package upside down and didn't realize that the Reliant was upside down. The nacelles were on the bottom. The roll bar was on top. And he signed it off. Yep, this is great. Use this. And sent it back to the art department. And by the time they got it, they were like, oh, there's not enough time to send it back and say, hey, this thing is upside down. Like, you need to, you needed to flip it over. So they just went with it upside down. I don't know how true that is, but it's a cool story nevertheless. So we get an exposure to the Miranda class. The Miranda class is much smaller than the Constitution refit class. It is kind of a light cruiser as opposed to the Enterprise, which is a heavy cruiser. It might not even be a light cruiser. I think it is, though. But the crew complement of the Miranda is much smaller. We can kind of figure this out based on there's maybe only about 15 of Khan's people left when they take over the Reliant, and they're able to take it over and run everything on it. So they can essentially run it with a skeleton crew. It's a smaller ship. So we get to see Chekhov, and Chekhov, announces that, hey, we're coming in on City Alpha 6, right? So this is unfortunately some sloppy mission prep on Starfleet's part, right? So they get to the system, and of course, they assume, hey, this is where City Alpha 6 is supposed to be. This is City Alpha 6, right? But their charts should have shown that there were more than just 5 planets. You know what I mean? Because City Alpha 5 is there, right? And they famously land on the wrong planet, and which is part of the whole problem, right? So it's like, okay, and Khan does mention that when Ceti Alpha 6 exploded, it did shift the orbit of Ceti Alpha 5. And that's kind of the only acknowledgement that you get, but somebody might have pointed out, hey, wait a minute, like the first time they surveyed this, like years ago, there were 6 planets in the system, and now there's only 5. So something's kind of wrong, but nobody points that out. Instead, they kind of get distracted by noticing that there is a signal of a life form on the planet. So they introduce Paul Winfield also as the captain of the Reliant, and Paul Winfield was, at this time, he was an Academy Award nominee. He had done a lot of television, which fits, of course, with Harv Bennett, using, like television actors that can just knock out these scenes as fast as possible and everything. So he's known to fans of science fiction, too. He plays a police lieutenant in Terminator. And he's also Captain Dathan in the episode Darmok, of Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra in The Next Generation. So it's really pretty cool. He's a solid actor. And they decide that they're going to, they contact Carol Marcus. This is the first time we get to see Carol Marcus. We get to see David. We get to see in a subsequent scene that David really kind of hates Starfleet. Like, he hates how Starfleet is as militaristic as it is. He thinks Starfleet are kind of goons, unthinking goons, and, they're just going to come in and they use scientists for the wrong thing. So before we get to that, they tell Carol that they're going to beam down and investigate, and maybe it's something they can transplant. A funny aside here for the prop people out there, when Carol Marcus is talking to Paul Winfield and Chekhov, there is a prop that is like right in the foreground, and it is this prop that has these red lights that just kind of bounce back and forth and rotate. And it might be one of the most famous like sci-fi props out there. It was used throughout the 80s. It wound up on The Next Generation, on Star Trek Voyager, on Enterprise even. And it's been in a dozen other movies and everything. And one of my favorite uses for it is actually in Airplane 2 when William Shatner has a cameo. He happens to walk right by this prop that has the bouncing red lights, and they totally call it out. This he walks out and he sees this crewman who's just looking at it, and he says something like, "Hey, how's it going?" And the guy goes, "Well, we've been working on this all day and we can't figure out what it does. These red lights just kind of go back and forth. That's it." And Shatner answers, "Well, the government wouldn't have spent a lot of money on a device that just has red lights going back and forth. That doesn't make any sense. Like, figure out what it does." And then he's interrupted by somebody saying, "Hey, these lights don't blink in sequence." And he answers, "Well, get them to blink in sequence." And it's just absolutely hilarious. And some of the jokes in Airplane 2 still stand up. It's really good. But so they tell Carol about this. We get a scene between Carol and David, who we don't really know who they are yet. We know they're scientists. We know that David is basically openly hostile to Starfleet. He says something along the lines like, "Every time we have dealings with Starfleet, I get nervous." And then he calls out by name James Kirk. He goes, "What about that overgrown old Boy Scout you used to run with?" And then Carol kind of just laughs it off and says, James Kirk was a lot of things, but he was never a Boy Scout, And then James Horner's score kind of changes because we get Captain Terrell and Chekhov beam down to the planet. And City Alpha set is just a gigantic sandstorm. Now, it's interesting how they filmed this because you're like, well, it's 1982. They don't have particle CGI to do some crazy stuff with it. So how are you going to film a sandstorm? Well, you build a sandstorm. So they took the largest stage that they had, covered everything in kind of rubber mats, and then filled it with sand, and then turned on these massive fans and created a sandstorm on the stage. It's just absolutely insane, And the costumes that Walter Koenig and Paul Winfield are wearing were actually sealed to keep all the sand and everything from coming out, but they're movie props, so they're not actual spacesuits. So they had to signal so that they could stop and get more air. It's just really, some low-tech filmmaking, but man, it shows up. And of course they see these cargo containers, right? So they see these cargo containers that are not there, that are just kind of out in the middle of nowhere along the sand dune. They go inside and they're looking around, and Captain Terrell is like, "Hey, where's the rest of the ship?" He can't figure out. He's like, "If they crashed here, where's the rest of the ship?" He can't figure it out. Why? They're looking around. They see little things. People have lived here for quite a while. There's a chess set made out of, bolts and spare parts and stuff. And then Chekhov kind of grabs onto a strap, and it turns out to be like a seatbelt strap. But he's looking at a bookshelf, and there are some books there, and there's the Bible, and there's King Lear, which I think is kind of a red herring. It's to throw you off because the other books are really telling. So you get Paradise Lost, which was famously quoted at the end of Space Seed, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And Khan called it out. So there's Paradise Lost. It's next to Dante's Inferno. And prominently, middle of the screen, Moby Dick. So right there, we don't know it yet, but right there, Nicolas Meyer is telling you Khan's story. Khan's story is Moby Dick, but we don't know that yet, right? And he's got a couple red herrings in there too. So Chekhov turns the strap around, and on the belt buckle, it says SS Botany Bay. And he kind of takes a moment and he recognizes the name and he's like, oh no, we have to get the heck out of here right now. And Paul Winfield's like, what's the matter with you? Like, what's going on? He's like, we have to go now, right? And so they leave and they run into some very Bedouin, like 15 Bedouin looking people just kind of standing there. And they force them back into the cargo containers and take off their helmets. And all these people are just kind of holding Paul Winfield and Walter Koenig. They're holding Tyrell and Chekhov prisoner, and this figure walks up. And it's a very imposing figure. And before we kind of describe this, I want to talk about how with the new uniforms, right, what the art director did is everything that Khan has is cannibalized from the ship. So the robes that they're wearing, they're kind of made out of seat covers. They're kind of the upholstery on the seats. Everything that they have has been cannibalized from what they had to use because they don't have any other materials. They're stuck to living on the contents of these cargo containers that they've kind of welded together to form a habitat on this extremely hostile planet with a perpetual sandstorm. So I just thought that was a really good attention to detail that isn't really explained in the film. And there are some anachronisms in it. Like later on, when we get to see Khan in his kind of full costume, he's wearing a necklace around his neck. And the necklace is actually a repurposed piece of the Starfleet uniform, which is the belt buckle, But those uniforms wouldn't have been around when he got left on City Alpha 5. So it is kind of an anachronism. He wouldn't have that. But it is what it is. It's a cool piece of a costume. It's pretty neat. And then also to clear things up, there was a rumor going around that like Ricardo Montalban couldn't possibly be that buff. And so that his chest is like some kind of a prosthetic kind of special effects chest piece, and it wasn't. Like he's seriously buff. Like, turns out Mr. Rourke did a lot of lifting on Fantasy Island, right? So Khan, this figure, shows up and very precisely kind of takes off his mask. He doesn't just kind of take it off. And there's an interview somewhere out there, it's on YouTube, where Ricardo Montalban talks about this, and he talks about how you couldn't just like fumble the mask off and just take it off and everything. It has to be a dramatic reveal, and it's every bit as part of Khan's character that Khan is in command of his movements at all times. And interestingly enough, when they got Ricardo Montalban, if you'll remember, we talked about how they wrote this entire script and never contacted him, just assuming that he would do it. When they contacted him, and he jumped at the opportunity, he like worked for scale and wound up donating a lot of his salary to the production because he really, really wanted to play a villain. And so he had done, I think Fantasy Island was in seventh season by this point. So he had been Mr. Rourke for quite a while. And so he kind of went back and tried to get into Khan. And then to his horror, realized he couldn't get it. He was stuck as Mr. Rourke. And he talks about how he asked Harv Bennett to send him Space Seed. And he wound up screening it, like 3 or 4 times. And just trying to remember what he was trying to do as an actor, as Khan. And it's very, very telling. I mean, he was just like, oh, Khan is driven by passion. That's his Achilles heel, right? And we saw that in Space Seed. When he interacts with Kirk, Spock prods Khan over and over and over again until Khan loses his cool and kind of shouts back and winds up revealing that he is one of the genetically engineered eugenics dictators, right? And then he congratulates Kirk because Kirk hasn't said anything. Kirk has just been watching. And Khan goes, excellent, excellent. because he's like, okay, you got me. So we know that Khan is driven by passion. And that passion is going to be dialed to 11 because of what happens next, right? So when he takes off his mask, Chekhov recognizes him. Chekhov says, Khan, right? And Khan's very slow about things. He's taking his time. He walks to Captain Terrell and he's like, I don't know. And then he walks over to Chekhov and he's like, I never forget a face, Mr. Chekhov. And a lot of folks point out that Chekhov was not in the episode of Space Seed. Walter Koenig had not joined the cast of Star Trek yet. And so there's no way Khan would have known who Chekhov was. There's some really easy headcanon. You don't even have to dive around in machinations to figure out how to explain this. It's that Chekhov was not a bridge officer. So we didn't see him until he became a bridge officer, because the show's about the bridge officers, right? So he was probably, there's, up to 400 other people on the Enterprise. And he absolutely would have known who Khan was if he was on board, because they took over the ship and they were torturing people and like putting Kirk in hyperbaric chambers and threatening to kill the captain. He would have absolutely known who Khan was. Not only that, if you follow the headcanon that I'm kind of pushing, that then Kirk had to do a massive cover-up, right, to keep his command, because he lost command and control of a Constitution-class starship. Everybody who was part of this incident would have been sworn to secrecy, and it is like a pivotal part of their lives. They would have absolutely remembered this incident. So I don't think it's that big a deal that Chekhov was not on the bridge and even on the show at the time that Khan actually showed up. So I just kind of, I go, this is easily explained away. And then we get to kind of the crux of why I talk about this kind of cover-up that happened is we get Khan starts to figure out that, oh, hey, you didn't expect to find me here. Like at first he's like, hey, we survived and everything, and here's guys from Starfleet and you guys are our tickets home. And I remember Chekhov, right? And Chekhov defies him. Chekhov says, actually, I think it's Terrell who says something like, I've never met Admiral Kirk. And Khan is like, Admiral Kirk? Like, what? Like, I've been stuck on this sandstorm planet, and this guy makes Admiral, and my wife is dead, and he's responsible? So he's definitely starting to get a little bit riled up, right? And then Chekhov kind of defies him by saying, you lie. On City Alpha 5, there was life. And we see Khan lose his cool. We see the passion break through, right? He's like, this is City Alpha 5. And we know that, oh no, right? And then, he's just sitting there going on and everything. A quick aside, we get to see Commander Kyle trying to reach Terrell. He's on the Reliant, and he's the communications officer. And he's trying to reach Terrell and Chekhov on the planet. And of course, they're not answering. And Commander Kyle was actually on the original show. He wasn't a commander. He was a crewman. But it was just really, really cool that this kind of little character, he's actually a recurring character on the original show. So he gets a little kind of, I don't know, maybe 10 seconds of screen time trying to raise them and everything. So that's particularly awesome. But Khan, there's another thing that's really kind of cool here. Khan wears a glove on his right hand. And in modern films, I feel like a lot of times filmmakers get into over-explaining every little thing. Like, Solo, a Star Wars story is a good example. They're trying to explain every single little thing. And it removes some of the mystery from stuff, and especially when things are not consequential. Khan wears this glove on his right hand. He never takes it off. It's never mentioned at all. You just kind of notice that he's wearing a glove. That's weird. And you can come up with whatever you want as to why he's wearing that glove. His hand is useful. It's not like crippled or anything like that. He's still able to do everything with it, but they just don't call attention to it. And then Khan gets to tell his story. He's like, you mean you never told the story of to amuse your captain, right? And Chekhov's just kind of like, oh, like what's going on? And then Nicolas Meyer does something, again, masterful in storytelling, right? He's going to have the villain monologue. Now, he's not the first guy to have the villain monologue, but most of the time when the villain monologues, it's, no, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die, right? And instead of just killing him outright, he's like, I'm going to leave you alive in some really complicated trap, and instead of watching you die because you've pissed me off and foiled all my plans, I'm just going to kind of leave you there and just assume that everything works out and leave, right? That's your normal villain monologuing. Nicolas Meyer has the villain monologue at the beginning of the film, right? We've only just met Khan. And so it's conceivable that a lot of the audience would not know who Khan was, right? They may not have seen Space Seed, or maybe the last time they saw Space Seed was in 1967. You don't know. So he has to tell the story, right? He has to bring the audience to speed. Now, the real easy way to do that would just be to kind of do a flashback and show clips of Space Seed, right? Keep in mind that this was kind of originally slotted to be a made-for-TV film, and that is totally a valid storytelling method, is to use a flashback and just cut in pieces of Space Seed and show Khan kind of doing the thing. But instead of using a flashback, he lets Khan tell his version of the story. Now, if you're familiar with Space Seed, you know that Khan is not telling the truth, but he's telling Khan's truth. And that's what's important here, is he's not telling exactly what happened. He's telling what happened from his point of view, because keep in mind that Khan is the hero of his own story, right? Now, I do think that he has a little bit of he has a little bit of contradiction going on there, because he casts himself in the role of Satan in Paradise Lost, and he casts himself in the role of Ahab in the rest of this movie. So he kind of understands that he's kind of the bad guy, but in his own mind, Khan is the hero. Khan is the one who's been wronged. You could easily tell this story as this guy who had this mad, crazy love affair and was trying to accomplish a mission and had to take over a ship to do it and lost. And the other captain understood that, hey man, this is just business, right? I would have done the same thing in your shoes. I'm not going to hold a grudge against you. We're going to drop you off on this planet. And because you're awesome and genetically superior and all this stuff, should be a cakewalk, right? And he gets sent down there and he's expecting kind of, hey, we're going to form a colony. We're going to do whatever. And they're going to check up on us. And no one ever shows up for years, for 18 years, right? And he loses the love of his life. He loses all of his people. We know that there were probably in excess of 70 people, maybe I think it was 80 on the Botany Bay. And now they're down to 15. And he got to see 20 of his people go insane by this indigenous life form, the SETI eels that we're about to meet, right? You could easily tell the story from his point of view. And how, oh, by the way, when the rescue party finally shows up, they weren't even expecting to find you. They're not even here to find you. They're here to do something else, right? And he's just like, okay, now things are unacceptable. Like if you had showed up and said, hey man, we are sorry, but given the vast distances of space, we just now found out SETI Alpha 6 exploded. And we're here to rescue whoever's left. I'm sure Khan would still be really pissed, but it's kind of bygones, right? Okay, you're here. It's a natural disaster. Nobody can do anything. But you weren't even here to find me. It's like, you found me by accident. So he comes to that conclusion. He's like, hey, you didn't expect to find me here. You thought this was City Alpha 6. And then, in a casual display of strength, he one-armed lifts Chekhov in his entire spacesuit off the ground. And he's like, why are you here? And Chekhov won't tell him, right? So he puts him down. He's like, okay, we don't have time to do this whole torture thing and everything. And he goes over to a tank. And it has these kind of little bumps moving under the sand that were done super low tech with a guy underneath a table moving a shape underneath a sand table with a stick. So super low tech, looks great, you get a lot of mileage out of some low tech stuff. And you get introduced to the Seti eel, and they are really repulsive, right? And he talks about how his wife died to one of these things. And he starts to explain how they work, and they make people really easily susceptible to suggestion. And he grabs a couple of the young and throws them in a bowl, and they throw them into the helmets of Terrell and Chekhov. And Chekhov starts freaking out because he's like, and Terrell is freaking out. You can tell because he is just sweating, just buckets, right? And Winfield plays it though. He's the captain. He can't show any weakness. He even tries to convince Khan's people. He's like, hey, you people, you don't have to do this. And then Khan interrupts him, and he's like, and there's actually a mistake in the script as well. He says, hey, these people swore to live and die by my orders 200 years before you were born. Well, it should be 300 years because they're in the 23rd century, and we know that the Botany Bay lifted off in like 1996. So it's just, unfortunate, but it's there. And I'll have to call it out because I call everyone else's, when I'm merciless on JJ. So I have to call him out on this one. But anyway, the Seti eels were just bits of like just polyurethane foam that they like kind of painted up and threw some raspberry jam on them to make them kind of icky and slick. And then they just, when they were on the actors' faces, they just pulled them with some string and made them look like they were inching along. It's just hilarious how low tech that is. And then they show the little eel going into his ear. And it was actually a big scaled up model of the ear so that they could have a big eel model, so they didn't have to miniaturize the thing. And we get a nice, very television-like cutaway after that scene that it's pretty horrible. So you're just like, oh man, this is really, really bad. James Horner's score here uses a lot of synthesizers to kind of punctuate what's going on in the scene. It's very, very well done. It's really cool, but it is very TV. Because right after that, right, Khan addresses and now subdued Chekhov and Captain Terrell, and he goes, now, tell me, why are you here, and where can I find James Kirk? Right? On a TV show, it would like fade to black, cut to commercial. You know what I mean? But they don't do that. But it is a very kind of TV construct scene, and it works beautifully, right? It then cuts away to a shuttle, and there's a small service shuttle kind of thing. It is not a full-blown shuttle, which that's why it doesn't head for the shuttle bay on the Enterprise. It's kind of a little service shuttle, and they're flying along. There is a portion cut from this scene that is not even in the director's cut, and it is a scene where they're all kind of any chance to get aboard the Enterprise. We get the original crew; they're all headed out there. Spock's already on board, and Kirk in this missing scene, Kirk tells Sulu that he's just assigned him the Excelsior, that he has cut the orders himself. And so Sulu's a captain in this point. But he kind of makes a joke that it's like, oh, I'm glad to have you at the helm. I don't think these kids can steer, right? But there's that scene that's missing. And what's interesting about that is that very clearly George Takei knows about that scene. So I don't know if they filmed it or if it was, in the script or whatever. But when they see the Excelsior, Sulu's the first one to call it out in Star Trek 3. He's like, there she is, the Excelsior. And it's only Scotty going, if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a wagon. kind of taking the wind out of his sails. But he's supposed to command the Excelsior, so it's just kind of interesting that this whole thing happens. And we'll talk about like the repercussions of this whole Khan event. And how it carries through this Star Trek trilogy of The Wrath of Khan, The Search for Spock, and The Voyage Home. So they get on there and we get more nautical stuff, actually heavy-handed nautical stuff. When the shuttle docks, we hear a bosun's whistle go off, and Kirk very pointedly asks permission to come aboard, and he's allowed on board. He stops and he talks to James Doohan. He's like, oh, Mr. Scott, you're good to see you well, or something like that. And James Scotty answers, I had a wee bout. And they kind of made a joke about it. He's like, well, I had a wee bout, but Dr. McCoy pulled me through. And Kirk goes, a wee bout of what? And McCoy kind of interrupts and goes, of shore leave. So you can take that to mean whatever you want. But what it is an actual reference to is that James Doohan had a heart attack in between filming Star Trek 1 and 2. And that's what they're alluding to in that scene. We also get introduced to Peter Preston, who is an engineer's mate. And we get his introduction because he should have been a much more important character. And his part got cut down. We will talk about that probably in the next episode, maybe a little bit down the road. But we get introduced to Peter Preston, and interestingly enough, we also get introduced to the torpedo room set. Because keep in mind, this is kind of service shuttle. That's where it docks. It doesn't dock at the rear of the Enterprise where the shuttle bay is. It kind of it docks in like right above engineering, in kind of that neck section in between the saucer section and the drive section. So it's just we get to see the torpedo room there. We've never seen this set before. This is new, and this also ties into Nicolas Meyer wanting a more kind of nautical Horatio Hornblower in space kind of thing. He wants to see people actually loading torpedoes. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense from a sci-fi point of view. They just have the torpedoes kind of auto-loaded from some storage location, and when you go to fire them, some automated mechanic would arm them, and then they go out the launcher, But Nicolas Meyer, again, this is a storytelling choice. He knows that they need to use it for the upcoming death of Spock. You can't just jettison Spock out of an airlock, right? So he needs to have that scene, have some gravitas, have some drama, and he's going to introduce this kind of torpedo room to increase the storytelling. The rule of cool takes precedence, whether it makes sense or not, right? If it's cool, you can get away with it. And that's what he wants to do. So Kirk starts going around on this inspection. We get to see him like pull out a handkerchief and he kind of dust checks, and he's just doing it as a formality. He's just like, okay, Scotty, whatever, And then Peter Preston kind of speaks up, in defense of the engine room, and Kirk is ribbing him kind of for Scotty's benefit. He's like, do you know how much ribbing I've had to take that the Enterprise is a death trap and all this stuff? And he's just kind of riling up, this young guy. And Scotty introduces in the director's cut an extra line that explains kind of the importance of Peter Preston. And he says that it's Scotty's nephew. And he goes, he's crazy to get to space. And Kirk says, yeah, that's every young man's fancy, if I remember correctly, right? So we're talking about age again, right? And then he kind of just gets on this lift and he goes, he's just like, hey, do you think do you think you're up for going on a cruise? Like taking the ship out, right? And McCoy asked him, well, what about the rest of the inspection? And he kind of mouths later. Like he's kind of done with it. He's just like, I don't want to inspect. These guys don't want to be inspected and I don't want to inspect. So let's just take the ship out and just do this little kind of trading cruise. Let's just jump right to it, right? So I'm going to wrap up this episode here because this is a good stopping point. The next time we start, we get to see the Enterprise in her full glory, exiting dry dock and being lit up. Beautiful model. And we'll talk a lot more about the visual effects and then and continue with our blow-by-blow and storytelling breakdown of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. So until next time, this is Mike, out. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.